We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Hey Amud Beis in Meseches Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 95b. The Gemara continues. Elo Amar Rava. Rather, Rava says Eishes Ish. When the Brisa said above, the Brisa said that there's a case of an Isser Kal, where the person who created the prohibition is prohibited. So for sure by Achos Isha, that's going to be the case. The situation, the case of the Isser Kal is Eishes Ish. This is like Rashi said on the previous Amud. Rashi over here says Elo Amar Rava Eishes Ish v'hainu Isser Kal, and that is considered an Isser Kal legabe Achos Isha. Eishes Ish, when it's relative to Achos Isha, is considered Isser Kal. Why? Lefi she'ena oser kol yamav, because the reason is by Eishes Ish, it's not a prohibition that lasts forever. Shafila v'chayiv yesh laheter beget, because even while he's alive, in theory, he can give her a get and make her mutter. Aval ishto ha'osrasa b'achoso sarta kol yamav, but the halach is by Achos Isha, as long as the wife is alive, so the sister is alive, there's no other way to get out of the Isser. And the Gemara continues, V'chein ki asa Ravin amar Rabbi Yochanan. Similarly, when Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Eishes Ish. What the Brisa is referring to is Eishes Ish, like we just said. Umay kari la Isser Kal. Now, why is Eishes Ish called an Isser Kal? She'ein ha'osra kol yamav, like Rashi just said, because the person who's creating the prohibition, meaning the husband, it's not forever. He could get her out of the prohibition by giving her a get. And the Gemara continues, Tanya nami hachi, we have a Brisa that supports this as well. Abba Chanan omer mishum Rebbe Lozer. Abba Chanan says in the name of Rebbe Lozer, Eishes Ish, it's talking about Eishes Ish. Uma b'makom habal Isser Kal, if in a situation when you have relations with an Isser Kal, in other words, another man has relations with his wife, she'ein ha'osra kol yamav, and that's an Isser Kal because the person creating the prohibition, the husband, doesn't ask her forever. Nesar ha'osra, but still the person who created the prohibition is prohibited, meaning to say the husband is prohibited to the wife. So habal Isser Chomer, so if you have a situation of relations with an Isser Chomer, meaning the sister of his wife, she'osra kol yamav, there the person who created the prohibition, meaning the wife, creates that prohibition forever. Eino din she'nesar ha'osra, so certainly the one that created the prohibition, meaning the wife, should be prohibited. That's the Kal V'chomer that we should say. And then the Brisa says we do not say that Kal V'chomer. Why? Because Talmud Lomer, because the pasuk says Osa. It says Osa, talking about by Eishes Ish. Osa shchivasa osarta. Only by her do we say that that laying with the other man creates a prohibition, and the husband can no longer be with his wife. Ve'en shchivasa chosa osarta. But if the husband is with her sister, that does not prohibit her. It does not disqualify him from being with his wife. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Brisa said, Rabbi Yossi Omer kol sheposel v'chulu. Rabbi Yossi said, anyone who disqualifies others disqualifies himself, and anyone who does not disqualify others does not disqualify himself. And the question is, what exactly does that mean? The Gemara asks, my kamer Rabbi Yossi, what exactly is Rabbi Yossi saying? If you're going to say that the Tanakama was saying as follows, the case is his wife and his brother-in-law went to Medinas Hayam, meaning his wife and the husband of his wife's sister, they went to Medinas Hayam, and it's unclear, maybe they died, they believe that they died, and so therefore he goes ahead and he marries his wife's sister. And so the Tanakama said that if his wife and his brother-in-law now come back and it turns out they're alive, so Eishes Giso Asira v'Ishto Sharia. So the Tanakama says the wife of his brother-in-law is actually usher to the brother-in-law because that's a situation of adultery. Really, her husband was alive and then she was with another man. However, his own wife is still permitted, even though he was with his wife's sister, but his own wife is permitted to him. The Kamer le Rabbi Yossi, and then according to this understanding, Rabbi Yossi is now saying back to the Tanakama, Ki he'echi de Ishto Sharia. Well, just like his wife is permitted, Eishes Giso Nami Sharia, so the wife of his brother-in-law should also be permitted. That's what Rabbi Yossi means to say, but that doesn't fit with the language. If so, Kol she'ein posel al yedei acherim, ein posel al yedei atzmo. It says anyone who does not disqualify others does not disqualify himself. It should be the opposite. It should be Kol she'ein posel al yedei atzmo, anyone who doesn't disqualify himself, because we're talking about the fact that he's permitted to his wife, so eino posel al yedei acherim, so shouldn't disqualify others, meaning to say that his brother-in-law should be able to be together with the sister of his wife, Mi Boile. That's what Rabbi Yossi should have said. So therefore, that doesn't make sense. That's the comment of Rabbi Yossi. And so the Gemara tries another direction. Viela, rather, Rabbi Yossi means as follows. Ki hechi de Eishes Giso Asira. Maybe it means the other direction. Just like the wife of his brother-in-law is prohibited, because that was a situation of adultery. So Ishto Nami Asira. So we should say that his wife also is prohibited. If he created a prohibition that affects his brother-in-law, that his brother-in-law can't be with his own wife, so then he shouldn't be able to be with his wife. But the Gemara says that still doesn't fit the language. Hatenach kol sheposel. That makes sense if you're saying anyone who disqualifies, because then we're saying exactly that point. If you disqualify others, so then you should disqualify yourself. But kol she'eno posel ma'avidate. But what are you going to do with the other line of Rabbi Yossi? If he doesn't disqualify others, he doesn't disqualify himself. We haven't explained that line. And so the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Ami says, our Reisha, this line of Rabbi Yossi over here is really going on the Reisha, meaning it's going on the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Nisas al pi bezdin, if she gets married through the permission of the court, so teitze, so then she has to separate from the man that she was with, upetzura min ha-karban, and she's parted from the carbon. Again, this is if her husband shows up and he's actually alive. Al pi edim, but if she does it through two witnesses, so teitze, so then she also has to separate. However, v'chayeves be-karban, but she's chayev to bring a carbon in that case. Yafe kocho shel bezdin shepatrim in ha-karban. And the Mishnah says that the strength of bezdin is great because it impatters her, it gets her out of bringing a carbon. The Kamar Tanakama, now on that the Tanakama is saying, Lo shna al pi edim de eshes giso sharia. It doesn't make a difference if it's through edim where it would be a situation, let's say the wife of his brother-in-law would actually be permitted in that case. V'lo shna al pi bezdin de eshes giso asir. And it would not make a difference if it was al pi bezdin where we normally say eshes giso is actually asira, meaning the wife of his brother-in-law is asir. And Rashi over here explains, Amar Rabbi Ami, hai kol she'no posel la reisha koy. Again, the line that if you don't disqualify others, then you don't disqualify yourself. That's going on the Reisha. The Airi beino posel al yedei acherim, which is talking about not disqualifying others. The Airi le'el benisas al pi edim teitze v'hi muteres labala, because there's a case over there before where let's say she marries al pi edim, so then she has to separate from the man that she was with, and she's mutter to her husband. The Katani Seifa, and then in the Seifa of that case, we had the opposite case, the case where the husband goes on a trip, the case rather where the wife goes on a trip, L'Medinas Hayam, and then she returns. The husband thinks that the wife has died. The halacha over there was that if his wife comes back and she's actually alive, so then in the interim he had married her sister, so mutaris lachzer lo. The halacha over there is that she's allowed to go back to him in a situation where it's the wife who took the trip, and then he married the sister, so the halacha is the wife is permitted. And so then the comment of the Tanakam is as follows. Lo shna al pi edim. Now it doesn't matter if there were two witnesses that said, Sha'amru lo mesa ishtacha, that said that your wife died. V'la achos ishto amru mes balech. And to the sister of his wife, the case over there is that the husband of the sister of his wife also was on the trip, and they told the sister of his wife that your husband has died. So in that case, when it was two edim, the eishes giso shari. In that case, we're actually more lenient in terms of the brother-in-law, and we say that the wife of the brother-in-law is permitted, meaning the brother-in-law is permitted to go back to his wife. Lachzer lebalik, she can go back to her husband. Lo shna al pi eid echad, and it doesn't matter if it's the eid echad situation where it was only one aid that said that the person's wife and the person's brother-in-law had died, even though in that case the eishes giso asura, even though in that case the wife of his brother-in-law actually is prohibited. In that case, when he was with the sister of his wife, so that actually was a situation of eishes ish, because her husband was still alive. That was his brother-in-law, and in that case where they only had that relations through the testimony of one aid, we actually say that that woman is prohibited to her husband, but still ishto sharia, but still we make a distinction and we say that his own wife is permitted to him. That's what the Tanakama was saying. It doesn't make a difference whether the sister-in-law is allowed or not allowed to her husband, meaning it doesn't matter if it was with two witnesses or with one witness, but still his own wife is going to be permitted to him. And so now the Gemara continues, V'ka'amar le Rabbi Yossi. So now Rabbi Yossi responds to the Tanakama and says that doesn't make sense. Al pi bezdin deposel al yedei acherim, in a situation where it was through bezdin, where it's disqualifying others, so posel al yedei atzmo, so it does disqualify him. You can't say if it's a situation where the brother-in-law is going to be prohibited, so he should also be prohibited to his wife. Al pi edim, but if it's al pi edim de'eno posel al yedei acherim, where it doesn't disqualify others, again when there are edim, so then that sister is permitted to her original husband, so eno posel al yedei atzmo, so then it's not going to disqualify himself as well, and that's what Rabbi Yossi was saying back to the Tanakama. And Rashi explains, V'kamar le Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says to the Tanakama, Bi'al pi bezdin plignalach. In a case where it's through the permission of the court, I argue on you. The whole of posel al yedei acherim, since others are disqualified, posel al yedei atzmo, so he's disqualified as well. Aval ba'al pi edim odinalach. But if it's through witnesses, so then since the others are permitted, meaning to say his brother-in-law can go back to his sister-in-law, so too he can go back to his wife. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Amar, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha says, Liolam HaSeifa, really this comment of Rabbi Yossi is going on the Seifa. And Hoda Azli Arusaso V'giso, in one case we're going on a case where his betrothed and his brother-in-law, they went on a trip. And Hoda Azli Ishto V'giso, in the other cases when it wasn't his betrothed, but it was actually his wife and his brother-in-law, and they went on the trip. The Kamar Tanakam, and so the Tanakam is saying, Loshna Ishto V'giso V'loshna Arusaso V'giso. It doesn't matter if it's his wife and his brother-in-law, it doesn't matter if if it's his arusa and his brother-in-law, the halacha is Eishes Giso Asura, the wife of his brother-in-law is going to be prohibited, V'ishto Shari, and his wife is going to be permitted. V'kamerle Rabbi Yossi, and so according to that, Rabbi Yossi now says back to the Tanakama, Ishto V'giso, by his wife and his brother-in-law, Deleka Lamemar Tanoah Havale B'Nisuin, when it comes to a wife, when it comes to a married woman, you can't possibly say there's a Tanai in the Nisuin. We usually don't have conditions in the Nisuin. So De'eno Posel Al Yedei Acher, so in that case where he's not disqualifying others, Eino Posel Al Yedei Atzmo, he doesn't disqualify himself. But Arusaso V'giso, when it comes to his betrothed, his Arusa and his brother-in-law, the Iko Lamemar Tanoah Havale B'Kiddushin, you could say there was a condition in the Kiddushin, Uposel Al Yedei Acherim, and it disqualifies others, Af Posel Al Yedei Atzmo, so too it would disqualify himself. And Rashi over here explains, Liola Maseifa Kedinakar V'Yazal Sidra de Masnisin. Really, Rabbi Yossi is going on the end of the Mishnah, according to the order of the Mishnah. Benisis Beit Echad, he's focusing only on the case where she marries on the basis of the testimony of one aid. Umay Posel Vein Poselika. So what does it mean when he talks about if it disqualifies others, disqualifies himself? If it doesn't disqualify others, it doesn't disqualify himself. So Chada Dazel Ishto V'Gisel Medinas Hayam. He's focusing on the following two cases. One case is, let's say, his wife and his brother-in-law go to Medinas Hayam, and again 1:8 says that they died. It turns out they did not. And in the other case we're going to focus on is a case where it wasn't his wife, but it was his arusa and his brother-in-law who went to Medinas Hayam, and again the same case, 1:8 said that they had died. So now Rabbi Yossi is going to make a distinction between the case of the ishto, of his wife, and the case of arusa, so the case of the woman that he betrothed. So in a situation of his wife where you can't say there was a tanai in the nisuin, because there's generally a tanai in kiddushin maybe, but there's no conditions in a nisuin. Lahai be'ishto rishona, there was no tanai with his original wife. Now, in this particular case, when his wife is going Lemedinas Hayam, and then he goes ahead and he marries her sister, and also, again, the sister's husband was also going Lemedinas Hayam, again, it was reported that they both had died. Everybody knows in this case that what happened was they made a mistake based on the testimony. They thought they had died, and really, they had not died. Now, in this particular case, nobody's going to think that the husband divorced his original wife and then decided to marry the next one, because here you're talking about sisters. Because here, even if he divorced his wife, he's usher to this other one. As long as his wife is alive, he can't marry her sister. And everybody knows it was the witnesses that misled everything. So Eino Posel Al Yedei Giso. So in this particular case, it's not going to disqualify the brother-in-law either. In a normal situation, the brother-in-law might not be allowed to marry his original wife. If his wife, if you had a situation like this where the wife got married thinking that her husband had died, so in a normal situation, if the husband was actually still alive, it could be problematic. But over here, it's not a problem. Kishar Isha Hanisis Beit Echad, like other cases where you have a wife that got married through the testimony of 1:8, it turned out that testimony was wrong. Why? Because over there you have a problem. In a normal situation where a woman gets married al piyed echad, so there you can have a confusion. People can think that maybe there actually was a divorce over here, and maybe he actually had divorced his original wife, and maybe he had actually divorced her rather, and then she married someone else, and then you have a situation where she's going back machzer grushaso. V'machzer amri ze machzer grushaso min hanesuin, and people think it's machzer grushaso min hanesuin. That's in a normal situation where people can think there was a divorce. But over here you don't have that possibility of a divorce in this particular case. The reason being because the person she's marrying is actually the man who is married to her sister, which wouldn't even be shaykh to do, and so therefore people understand that what happened over here was that everybody thinks that these people had died. Therefore in this particular case, so since the brother-in-law is okay to go back to his sister, to his wife rather, so therefore he's okay to go back to his original wife as well. Since he didn't disqualify others, he doesn't disqualify himself. But in contrast, Rabbi Yossi would say, let's say the first wife was not his wife, it was just the woman that he betrothed, it was his arusa. So in that case, there is a point of confusion. People might think there was a condition in the original kiddushin. And so there people might actually think that the marriage that he had to the second woman, to the sister, was actually a good marriage. And people will then also say that what happened was was her husband divorced her and then she got married. V'mishum achosisha. And if you're going to say, well, how could that be? But it's a problem of achosisha. It's not a problem of achosisha, because to not have a lo b'kedusha rishona, because this guy who's marrying the sister, the first kedushin wasn't really a good kedushin. There was some condition in that kedushin. There was a tanai, and the tanai was not fulfilled. So maybe he never really was married to her sister. And so now what happened? The woman that was the arusa died, who he never really was married to, because people will think there's a tanai over there. That's what people will think. And then people will also think, if that was the case, maybe there was actually a divorce over here between the brother-in-law and the wife, and that's why he's marrying the wife, and now you have an issue of machzer grushaso. Velonis kayim, again, the tanai wasn't fulfilled. V'hadra eshes gisa labala. So again, if the wife or the brother-in-law is going to go back to her husband, so then amri inshi mutter lachzer grushaso mishanisas. People will get confused and think that you're allowed to be machzer grushaso once she married in the interim. Hilkachu posel al yedei acherim. Therefore, in this case, when you're talking about arusa, it's going to disqualify others, meaning this marriage is going to cause that the brother-in-law is not going to be allowed to return to his original wife. So since it disqualified others, it's going to disqualify him also. That's what Rabbi Yossi says, and therefore he can't go back to his original wife as well when it turns out that she's alive. So that's what Rabbi Yossi will say. Now, the Tanna Kama does not make a distinction between Arusa and Ishto. Well, the Tanna Kama, Taima Dahanisis Be'ed Echad Asur Al-Achzor. So what does the Tanna Kama hold? He holds that in general, the reason why, let's say, a woman marries Al Pi Eid Echad, the reason why she's not allowed to return, Lav Mishum Shem Yomru Zemachzer Grushaso Mishanisis. It's not for this reason. It's not because we're afraid people will think that this was a case of Machzer Grushaso Mishanisis. People will think that. That's not the case. Ela Mishum, the Konsur Rabbanan. It's a different reason altogether. The Rabbanan give a fine on the woman. They give a knaster. Mishum de lo daika shaper, because she wasn't careful. Hilkach kol man denasva pasal akama. Therefore, anybody who she goes ahead and marries is going to disqualify her to the first husband. In other words, according to the Tanna Kama, the brother-in-law is always going to be prohibited to his original wife, because that's a situation where this woman went ahead and married someone else, and she should have been more careful and made sure that her husband had died. And the Tanna Kama is always going to make a distinction and say the man who married this woman, he's allowed to go back to his original wife, the one that he thought had died. That's going to be okay. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. The halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. And Rashi over here says, Halacha ke Rabbi Yossi, kasal kadaitach hakula milsa de Rabbi Yossi koi Shmuel. Right now we think that Shmuel is going on everything that Rabbi Yossi said. V'yamar dahai de mitzvah isha hanisas beid echad, and meaning to say that which we say that a woman who marries according to the testimony of one witness, why is she prohibited? If it turns out that her husband is alive, why is she prohibited to go back to her husband? Mishum shema that's because we're afraid people are going to think that she was actually divorced from her original husband and then she married someone in the interim. And people will think it's an issue of machzer grusha. So that's what we think is the reason in general. And in any situation where you could come to that confusion, there's going to be a prohibition. Even if it's the sister of the arusa of the first one. Because when it's an arusa, like we said, there people might think that there was a condition in the original marriage, and therefore they could come to think this issue that it's machzer grushaso mishanisas, like we said, and therefore it's prohibited in that particular case. And so the Gemara continues, Maskif lo Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asks the following question. Umiyam ar Shmuel hachi, does Shmuel really say that the halach is like Rav Yossi? Voyetmar, but we have the following machlokas amoraim. Yevama, when it comes to Yevama, Rav Amar harehi keishes ish. Rav says she's considered like an eishes ish, like a married woman. Ushmuel Amar eino keishes ish, and Shmuel says she's not like a married woman. And the Gemara is about to explain what this means. V'amar Rav Huna, and Rav Huna said as follows. Could go in the case that they're arguing about is, for example, as follows. Shekidesh let's say a person's brother was Mekadesh a woman. And then that person, that brother, he went on a trip to Medinas Hayam. And now the person heard that his brother died. So he went ahead and he goes ahead and marries this woman because now his brother died. The Rav says she's like an Eishes Ish and she's prohibited to the brother-in-law. But Shmuel says she's not like an Eishes Ish, and then she's going to be permitted to the brother-in-law. And Rashi over here says, what does this mean, Eishes Ish, that Rav is saying? Again, the brother was Mekadesh the woman. Shilmali nasa risha. Now, let's say the brother had actually married the woman, so then tarvayu modu du mutaris lachzer lo. Then everybody would agree that it's mutter for her to go back to the original brother. To lekal ameimer machzer grushaso, because nobody's going to think that's the case of machzer grushaso. To hakol yodim shatosai. Everyone is going to realize that a mistake was made over here, that he thought that his brother had died, and he really had not died. Shem girsha lo haisa nisis lachib, because had there been a situation of a divorce, so then she would have never married the brother, because that's a problem of eishes ach. Avol kidesh bahi, but if it's a situation of kidesh, if it's a situation just of kiddushin, so bahi amar Rav, in that case Rav says, harehi ke'eshes ish, she's like an eshes ish, hanisis beit echad, who's getting married on the basis of the testimony of one aid. Sha'asura l'bala, and Rav says therefore she's also to go back to her husband. V'zunami asura l'rishon, and this woman also is going to be also to go back to her first husband. Shu achshav Yevama, that first husband is now really her brother-in-law. The amriyin she harishon to not havale b'kiddushin, because here's what people will think. People will think that the first one really there was a tanai in the kiddushin, then the kiddushin really wasn't a real kiddushin. V'lo neskayim, the tanai wasn't fulfilled. Umuteres ha'isel, and they'll think on the basis of that she was really mutter to the second brother all along. V'achshav and now she's leaving the second one. V'nosa rishon, and she's marrying the first brother. V'nimtza nosa es eishes achav, and people will think that she's going ahead and she's marrying, that this is a situation where a person is marrying the wife of his brother. In other words, according to Rav, in this particular case, if it would be a situation of kiddushin, so there's a real point of confusion, because people will think maybe her first marriage or her kiddushin was not a kiddushin at all, and therefore the marriage that she had to the second brother was a good one, and now it's a problem of eishes ach. But Shmuel says, no, that's not true. She's not considered like an Eshes Ish, and she's permitted to go back to her first husband. She's permitted to the first husband. Why? We don't say that maybe there was a condition. That's very uncommon. Everybody's going to know, according to Shmuel, the only possibility is that there was a mistake in terms of the witnesses. They thought that the brother had died, and that's why the second brother married her, because he thought it was a situation where he's allowed to marry her because his brother had died. And then again, so according to that, since everybody realizes that it was a mistake, she's allowed to go back to her original husband. Alma l'Shmuel lo maski inshi tanoadatai. The point over here is that you see, according to Shmuel, nobody thinks of this idea that there was a condition in the kiddushin. V'gabe arusaso v'giso. So if that's the case, so going back to our original case, where we have a case of his arusa and his brother-in-law. Amay amar Shmuel halacha Rabbi Yossi. Why would Shmuel say the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi? Demitzra eshes giso legiso, who said again that the wife of the brother-in-law is prohibited to the brother-in-law, because again that was on the basis of the idea that people will think there was a tanai in the Erison, and that's the contradiction over here that we are asking. And so the Gemara continues, Amar le Abaye, so Abaye says back to Rav Yosef, Umimai dechi Amar Shmuel halacha ke Rav Yossi. Now how do you know that when Shmuel said the halacha is like Rav Yossi, ad Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Kamer, that he's going on the version of Rav Yossi, of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha? Dilma ad Rabbi Ami Kamer, maybe he's going on the version of Rabbi Ami. And Rashi over here says, Dilma ad Rabbi Ami, kidetirtza Rabbi Ami l'taima de Rabbi Yossi. Again, Rabbi Yossi just made a statement that if he disqualifies others, he disqualifies himself. If he does not disqualify others, he doesn't disqualify himself. And Rabbi Ami had a different interpretation of what that meant. Delo Iri b'tanah cloud, that it's not talking about tanoim, it's not talking about conditions at all. Diafilu beishto v'giso nami posel. According to Rabbi Ami, even if you had a situation of his wife and his brother-in-law, let's say it wasn't an arusa, but it was his actual wife. So he said, since the situation is that the brother-in-law is forbidden to his wife, to his original wife, so too he is going to be forbidden to his wife. Even though in that case there's no concern of a tanai, it was just a general idea that if he passels others, if his relationship, the fact that he married this woman, so this woman thought that her husband had died, that was the brother-in-law, and that is enough to say that the brother-in-law can no longer marry his wife, so therefore he also cannot marry his wife that he thought had died. And that was the idea of Rabbi Ami's understanding of Rabbi Yossi, and maybe that's what Shmuel was going on when he said the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. With the Shmuel ad the Shmuel sulo kasha. Now, according to that, it's not going to be a contradiction in Shmuel. To lo dami achos isha v'yeshes ach, because you can't really compare the case of achos isha. Again, the case of Rabbi Ami is a situation of achos isha to a case of eshes ach, which is the case that Shmuel was talking about. The achos isha, because when it comes to a situation of achos isha, ikadem v'asa giso makam meishto. Let's say what happens is his brother-in-law comes back first before his wife returns. So now his brother-in-law comes back. It turns out that his brother-in-law was alive all along, and he should not have married the wife of his brother-in-law. So in that case, hamitzra eshes giso giso miyada giso. So the wife of the brother-in-law is going to be totally prohibited to the brother-in-law. End of story. Uboy get misheni, and she's going to require a get from the second person that she married. Mishum shema yomer giresh zev and asazeh, because there we have a real concern over here that maybe people are going to think that what happened over here actually was that there was a divorce. She divorced her original husband, then she married a second husband, and then you have a situation of machzir grushaso. V'amri mishum achos isha, amri mesa ishto. And if you're going to say that it's a situation, maybe it's achos isha, so why would she have ever married the second man? That man was married to her sister. That's not a problem, because right now we think that the wife died. Avol b'eshes achiv, but when it comes to a situation where it's just a case of eshes achiv, again, his brother just goes out on a trip. So there, mechichazu da'asa achiv, when people see that his brother has returned, sulo amri giresh zev and asa zeh, nobody's going to say that there was a divorce and then he married, because that's a case of grushas achav. You can't marry the divorcee of your brother, and therefore they're totally not comparable cases, and it's not a contradiction at all. And because again, Shmuel will say that nobody's going to think there was a Tanai in the original Kedushin, and so therefore again, by Eshes Achav, it's going to be perfectly permissible when that brother comes back, he can take back his old wife, and that has nothing to do with the case of Rabbi Ami in the situation of the brother-in-law coming back, where we're talking about a situation of Achos Isha. So there's actually going to be a prohibition, like we said, since it disqualifies others, it's going to disqualify him as well. And the Gemara continues further and says, "V'inami ad Rabbi Yitzchak nafcha." Even if you're going to say that when Shmuel said the halacha was like Rabbi Yossi, he was going on Rabbi Yitzchak nafcha's version of Rabbi Yossi. Mimai da posel. How do you know that he's going on the disqualification side of the statement? Maybe he's going on the not to disqualify side of the statement, as Rashi over here explains. V'inami ad Rabbi Yitzchak nafcha mimai da posel ka'amar Shmuel halacha v'tikshalach. You're assuming that Shmuel is saying the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, and he's going on the disqualified side, and that's why you had a contradiction in Shmuel. But Dilma l'Shmuel afilu barusaso v'giso nami lo pasel. Maybe that's not true. Maybe according to Shmuel, even in a situation where you have an arusa, where the woman was just betrothed, Shmuel would say, we're not worried about the situation that people will think there's a Tanai in the Kedushin, and he's not going to disqualify. V'hai d'kamer halacha Rabbi Yossi, and when Shmuel said the halacha was like Rabbi Yossi, a'ein posel kamer, he was going on the case where there's no disqualification, meaning to say, li'afuke midatana kama da'afilu gabe ishto v'giso de'eshes giso asir, because the Tanakama said that if you have a situation, the Tanakama always made a distinction between the person's wife. He said that person can always take back his wife if it turns out she was alive, but the sister that person married, so she married him thinking her husband was dead, thinking the brother-in-law was dead, so she's never allowed to. That's what the Tanakama said. Tanakama always made that distinction and said the husband who thinks his wife has died, he's going to be okay. But the person that he married, meaning she thought her husband had died, she's not going to be okay to go back to her original husband. That's what the Tanakama had said. And Kamash Malon Shmuel, and that's what Shmuel's going on. Shmuel's saying that no, that's not true. Rabbi Yossi Desharia, we're going like Rabbi Yossi, who says that in that particular case it's going to be permitted. And Rashi over here is referring to the fact that again, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha said that according to the Tanakama, Loshna Ishto V'giso, Loshna Arusaso V'giso, it doesn't make any difference if it's his wife that went on the trip or his Arusa that went on the trip. It's always the same, like we just said. Eshes Giso Asira, we say always the wife of his brother-in-law is always going to be prohibited. She married a man thinking her husband had died, that's going to be a problem. V'ishto Sharia, but his own wife, meaning the guy who married the sister, he's going to be okay to go back to his original wife if it turns out that she is still alive. That's what the Tanakama had said. So the Tanakama was always strict when it came to Eshes Giso. And then Rabbi Yossi said back, again to review, Rabbi Yossi said back that Ishto V'giso, by his wife, if it's not an Arusa, but if it's a case of a wife, so then we say, since Eino Posel Al Yedei Acher, since in that particular case, we say there's no disqualification by the brother-in-law, so Eino Posel Al Yedei Atzmo, so then there's no disqualification by himself, he can take back his wife. That's what Rabbi Yossi had said. So it turns out that according to Rabbi Yossi over here, in that case, Rabbi Yossi is lenient by the brother-in-law. Rabbi Yossi is saying by Ishto that we're lenient, even by the case of Ishto V'giso, that we're actually lenient. Then Rabbi Yossi went on to say that by Arusaso V'giso, there we're going to be strict by the brother-in-law, so there will be strict by this person as well. He can't take back his wife. So maybe Shmuel was only going on that first part of the statement of Rabbi Yossi, where Rabbi Yossi said in that particular case, Eino Posel Al Yedei Acher. By the case of Ishto V'giso, Rabbi Yossi is actually lenient, more lenient than the Tanakama, and says that actually the woman who married him, thinking that her sister and her husband had died, that woman is allowed to return to her original husband. And maybe that's all that Shmuel was saying, but he wasn't going on the other case. He wasn't going on the stringency of Rabbi Yossi. He was just going on this leniency of Rabbi Yossi by the actual married woman. He wasn't going on the Arusa case. And we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Vav Amud Aleph.